This week, Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland said that the Canadian Parliament shouldn't ratify the new NAFTA deal until U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum have been lifted. She also encouraged members of the U.S. Congress not to reopen the deal, as some are proposing. 9 months ago, the Trump administration imposed almost $16 billion worth of tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Canada retaliated in kind. The International Monetary Fund is estimating that the tariffs are costing the two economies more than $500 million. So what can be done to eliminate the tariffs? Should Parliament here in Ottawa ratify the deal before it adjourns in June to prepare for the fall federal election? Answers to all those questions depend very much on what's going on south of the border. So joining me now is Laura Dawson, the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre, and she's in Washington. Ms. Dawson, thanks for taking the time.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, let's start. I'm going to be very Canada-centric in my first one or two questions. First of all, tariffs. What can you tell us? We know that Chrystia Freeland was just recently down speaking to Robert Lighthizer, the trade representative. Where do tariffs stand?
The tariffs are just stuck in place. I mean, as we know, we have the United States imposing steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, and then Canada retaliating with a relatively equal value of tariffs on United States products, not just on steel and aluminum, but a range of other things from farm products to manufactured products. So we've got a really expensive, destabilizing, wrench thrown in the works of U.S.-Canada trade, and it doesn't show any signs of letting up. I mean, we were under the impression that this was a temporary tariff that maybe would continue just through the NAFTA negotiations until we had a deal. Now we have a draft text on the table, but the president likes this device. It is one of the few trade instruments, one of the few tariffs that the president himself can impose without having congressional approval. So he likes that kind of power, and he's happy to throw it around, and he's been using this as a way to encourage other countries to do what he thinks he wants them to do.
We keep getting reports that, oh no, they're on the verge of negotiating some sort of quota system that would replace the tariffs and all that, but you're saying there's no real indication of any concrete movement yet.
Well, there could be a deal in process that we're just not aware of. I mean, we know the president likes to be able to use this tariff, but at the same time, I think he might be a little bit tired of kicking around Canada. Still enjoying kicking around Mexico, apparently, but Canada seems to be off the hit list. One of the big sticking points, though, is Canada would just like to get these tariffs withdrawn entirely, make them go away, and never to be seen again. The United States is saying, well, Canada, we're not so sure about that. How about instead of a tariff on steel and aluminum, we'll give you a quota. That means that there's a certain amount of product that you can ship to the United States duty-free, but if you go above this level, then we're going to put a tariff on. First of all, Canada said, oh, no, we're not interested in quotas at all. That's not in the spirit of free trade. And then they started thinking about the quotas, but the quota level is not high enough. It is below historic levels of trade. So Canada would have, in effect, be agreeing to a deal that would put them worse off tomorrow than they were yesterday. So my thinking is that they might be doing some horse trading on quota level, that Canada might be backing off and saying, okay, we're willing to accept this suboptimal deal as long as it lets our businesses continue, and the U.S. is pushing them for a lower than desired quota level. That's what I think is happening, but they're not calling me up and telling me minute by minute.
Okay, another question in terms of strategy. I just mentioned Chrystia Freeland, our Foreign Affairs Minister. Should Canada link the ratification here in Canada of the Canada-USA-Mexico agreement to movement on tariffs?
Well, I might be completely wrong on this, but I think that those two issues have become decoupled. There were folks in Canada who were saying, "Hey, let's ratify this early and before Parliament rises, before an election, and that will be seen as a sign of support for the U.S., as a gift to the U.S., and that sign of support will then encourage the U.S. to lift the tariffs because it will give them a better chance for ratification in the United States." But as we've been looking looking at over these past days and weeks, the U.S. ratification process is just stretching out months, if not years. So it's not an easy quid pro quo. We ratify, you lift the tariffs, you ratify. I think the two issues have actually become disconnected. And what I think Canada needs to do is focus exclusively on those tariffs, on getting them lifted and linking up Canada's interests with its American buyers and sellers, the folks that are being hurt in the United States by these tariffs that can influence their own members of Congress and say, enough is enough, game's over, let's get back to business.
So what you're saying is there's not necessarily anything in it for Canadian politicians and our Canadian Parliament to ratify the CUSMA, the Canada-USA-Mexico agreement, before the federal election. There's nothing in it for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think Canada would be giving a gift to the United States, but a gift is only useful if somebody recognizes its value. So the gift of early ratification is a gift that Canada would give to the White House, but the ratification process is in the control of Congress right now. And so it's Congress, it's going to take its own sweet time to try to decide whether the deal is acceptable, when they might want to introduce the legislation, and then once that legislation is introduced, it could take between 25 and 50 weeks for it to jump through all the hurdles that it needs to jump through in the U.S. legislature. And don't forget, Nancy Pelosi is currently the Speaker of the House. Last time she was Speaker of the House in 2007, she had 3 free trade agreement texts that were brought to her, one on U.S. Korea, one on U.S. Central America, one on U.S. Colombia, and she said, nope, I'm declining to introduce the legislation for any of those agreements. And so those agreements were left on the sidelines for her entire tenure. That could very well happen in this case. Even if it doesn't, there's a lot of freshman Democrats who need to be convinced that this deal is in their interest, in their constituents' interest, and they're starting to pick this thing apart piece by piece.
Well, this is where things get really intriguing for Canadian watchers. First of all, the assertion that, you know, whether we ratify or not, there's nothing in it for us to be in a rush because it's going to take so long, and I want to get back to that, so long for the Americans to ratify it. But then second, you're saying that there are lots and lots of reasons why the new Congress is going to find to take its royal time. What kind of, we've heard about the environment, we've heard about pharmaceuticals. What are the Democrats in a majority position now in the House of Representatives? What kind of delays are we going to see?
Yeah, see, I mean, that's, for me as somebody who watches trade policy, that's the frustrating thing, is there's not a lot in the deal that is seriously problematic. I mean, it is very similar to the original NAFTA with a few tweaks in a few different directions, and is very similar to the Trans-Pacific Partnership text, which the old Democrats under President Obama were quite happy with. So there's not a lot that's new here, but we've got freshman members of the legislature. They're not familiar with governance. They're not familiar with the technical aspects of trade agreements, but they know that environment, labor, and drug prices sell to their base. So they say, well, there must be, you know, things about that we disagree with. On drug prices, what they're really talking about is a very small aspect of the deal that has to do with data protection for biologic drugs. That is, drugs that are made through cellular lines. They're hard to make, they're extremely complicated, they're extremely expensive. The U.S., now I'm going to get wonky, and I'm sorry, Martin, but the U.S. already has 12 years of data protection for that kind of drug in the United States. The new USMCA offers 10 years. Somehow the U.S. Legislators think that if they get drug protection out of the USMCA, that it's going to affect American drug prices one way or another. But as long as they've already committed to 12 years, 2 years longer than the free trade agreement amounts to, it's not going to change U.S. drug prices one bit.
What about labor?
So that's one aspect.
What about labor? Because
labor?
we've heard, and the automotive sector and the labor regulations in Mexico, because the Mexican president supposedly, López Obrador, has promised that they will be bringing in labor changes by April 30th. He's promising.
Right. So they're talking about labor. I've looked at first of all, having the Mexican changes is a prerequisite, but it's not the only condition, as Nancy Pelosi says. Having those Mexico changes in place is important. AMLO has said he's going to make them. I have read that various bills have been introduced in the Mexican legislature, but they're a little bit competing, and there's a little bit impartial. And even if the new legislation is in place, there's some suggestion that Mexico also has to dissolve old contracts that it had with previous employers. So it's a bit of a thorny mess in terms of having Mexican labor changes done and dusted in a way that will satisfy Congress. That is not the only thing, though, that we have to worry about in terms of enforcement. Monitoring these new automotive provisions are going to be hugely difficult, hugely expensive. There's been changes to the dispute settlement process that's going to affect labor and environment in a good way, but people aren't sure if these dispute settlement changes are good enough. Is it really going to solve the problem? So it is very unclear, lots of murk, and no strong champions in the United States saying, yep, we got to do it, we got to do it now.
Okay, last question. We only have about 30 seconds, but if, as you predict, or people down there are predicting, it could take between half a year and a year, or maybe even longer, to pass this through the American Congress. The threat was before, for us Canadians, was Donald Trump's threat that, look, if this doesn't work, I will rescind NAFTA 1. I will scrap NAFTA 1. We'll go back to maybe the free trade agreement or whatever. But you're saying that one of the comforts, if we here in Canada can just wait for the American game to be finished, is that the president seems to be at least not making that threat anymore. He's not going to rescind NAFTA 1.
Yeah, I think he's either grown tired of that and he's looking for different fish to fry. He's certainly gone after Mexico on a lot of different things lately. But also, I think that, for example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Farm Bureau have been really, really effective here in the United States of convincing the president that pulling the plug on NAFTA would be economic suicide for the United States. So I think he's grown tired of that threat. I think we can take comfort in maintaining the status quo until we get NAFTA 2.0, and that's a good thing because it's going to be a long, long time, in my opinion, till we get to full ratification.
So up here in Canada, we'll just have a coffee and wait for a year.
Exactly. Have a coffee, wait it out. We're nothing if not a patient people.
All right. Thank you very much. Your advice and your insight is always appreciated. Thanks a lot, Laura Dawson.
You're welcome.